It was the spring of 1887 in a place called Dry Hollow, Arizona Territory. A quiet patch of dust and timber where the sky stretched wide and secrets didn't stay buried for long. The town's chapel stood alone at the edge of town, its white paint long chipped by wind and sun. That day the bell rang slow, the kind of sound that makes a man pause in his tracks. Inside, mourners filled the pews. Women clutched handkerchiefs. Men bowed their heads. And up at the front stood Martha Ellsworth, dressed in black, holding her little girl close. 4 years old, Lucille Ellsworth was barely old enough to understand what a funeral meant. But she knew enough to feel something was wrong. The coffin rested just a few feet away, closed tight. Samuel Ellsworth, Martha's husband, lay inside, or so they believed. Lucille kept pointing at it. "Papa," she whispered. "Papa's talking." At first, folks thought it was grief, the kind that twists the mind of a child. But when she said it again, louder, more certain, "Papa's calling me from in there," the room fell still. The preacher cleared his throat, tried to continue, but every ear had shifted. People exchanged glances. A few made the sign of the cross. Martha bent down. "Shh, baby," she murmured, brushing Lucille's hair back. But the child clutched her dress tighter and said, "He's stuck, Mama. He's scared." Martha froze. Her hand instinctively touched the inside of her coat pocket, where she'd kept something she couldn't let go of. A silver pocket watch, Samuel's. It had stopped ticking the very moment he collapsed, 2:47 p.m. She hadn't been able to wind it since. But she carried it, every hour since, as if time itself could be rewound. The wind slipped through the warped boards of the church, carrying the desert's heat and a strange silence. And then, the church doors opened with a long groan. In walked Henry McGraw, Samuel's cousin. Dressed in dark wool and shiny boots, he nodded solemnly at the gathered crowd before making his way down the center aisle. His presence always carried a chill with it, like a man used to getting what he wanted. He stopped beside Martha. "Cousin," he said softly, "you must be exhausted." She didn't look at him. Henry turned toward the coffin. "We're all broken up about Samuel," he murmured. "Such a strong man. Hard to believe he's gone." Then he leaned in, voice lower than before. "I know this is a hard time, but the land Samuel held, it's going to bring trouble. Debts, legal folk. Maybe it's best to let it go now, for Lucille's future." Years ago, Henry and Samuel had shared more than blood. They'd once worked the same fields, split fence rails, dreamed of futures built side by side. But where Samuel chose home and family, Henry chased opportunity, and it turned him bitter. He believed that land should have been his. The grudge had festered ever since a failed cattle venture, and a broken promise left them on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence. Martha's jaw tightened. 2 days. It had only been 2 days since Samuel collapsed by the barn, and here was Henry, talking about land. Beside her, Lucille tugged again, whispering up through her tears, "Papa says don't let him take it." Martha's breath caught. The coffin remained still. But something in the air had shifted. Something was wrong. Outside, the wind picked up, whipping dust against the chapel walls like a warning from the desert itself. Inside, silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Little Lucille pressed herself against her mother's leg. Her fingers, small and pale, trembled as she pointed once again to the closed coffin. "He says he's stuck," she whispered, barely louder than breath. "He says it's dark and he can't move." Martha Ellsworth didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on that wooden box. Something cold unfurled in her chest, a mother's instinct, one that knew when danger stood close, even in a place meant for peace. Her hand slipped back into her pocket, fingers wrapping around the cool silver of Samuel's watch. She could still see it clearly in her mind, the way he'd wind it every morning before stepping out. It hadn't ticked since he fell. But now, something in her needed to believe it could tick again. Whispers rolled through the pews like wind through prairie grass. "She keeps saying he's alive," someone murmured. "Maybe she don't know what death means," said another. "She's 4. That kind of talk don't come from nowhere." An old woman with silver hair and worn hands, Widow Rosalind Baxter, leaned toward her neighbor. "Children can see what we won't," she said, "especially when love binds them close to the grave." The preacher tried to regain control. He cleared his throat, lifted his Bible. But the words hung hollow in the charged air. Martha bent low to her daughter again. "What do you hear, Lucy?" she asked gently. Lucille's eyes filled with tears. "He says it's cold. He says he can't breathe." The room seemed to contract. Then, without warning, the great wooden doors creaked open again. Bootsteps echoed down the center aisle. Marshal Matthew Boone had arrived. His coat was dusted from the trail, his revolver resting at his side. But his expression was not that of a lawman come to enforce order. It was the face of a friend, grave and urgent. He removed his hat as he approached Martha. "I came as soon as I heard," he said low. "But there's something you ought to know." Boone was a quiet man, lean and watchful. Folks said he could smell a lie like smoke on the wind. He never raised his voice, but once he'd stopped a lynch mob with nothing but a look. His justice wasn't loud. It was inevitable. Martha turned to him slowly. "Before Samuel passed," the marshal continued, "he told me Henry was pressuring him hard about that land. Pushed him near to rage. Samuel said he'd never sell it. Told me straight." Martha's eyes darkened. "And then he was dead 2 days later." Boone nodded. Before she could speak again, Lucille's voice pierced the heavy stillness. "He's crying now, Mama." The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. Martha stood. Gasps fluttered across the church. Even the preacher went silent. All eyes turned to the coffin. And then it happened. A soft knock from within. A woman screamed. Another dropped her prayer book. Louder, more urgent. Martha staggered back, eyes wide with horror. Lucille tugged her dress again. "He's calling your name." The chapel was no longer a place of mourning. It had become a place of fear. For a long moment, no one moved. The sound had been unmistakable, a knock. From inside the coffin. Not once, not twice, but steady, deliberate. Martha stood frozen, her breathing shallow. Around her, the mourners edged back, eyes wide with disbelief and dread. The preacher whispered a prayer under his breath. Lucille's fingers gripped tighter around her mother's coat pocket, right where that silver pocket watch still rested. The one that hadn't ticked since 2:47 p.m. The one that Martha couldn't let go of, as if time itself was waiting for her to believe. Then, from the back of the church, a woman's voice rose. "This ain't right. The child said he was alive. And now we hear knocking." A man near the doorway crossed himself 3 times. "It's a curse, a spirit begging to be set free." Marshal Boone stepped forward, calm but sharp-eyed. "Ain't no curse," he said. "That's a man still breathing." Boone never carried more than 1 bullet in his chamber unless he meant to use it. He had seen enough war and worse, and he didn't rattle easy. But the way he stood now, just one hand resting on the coffin, told everyone he knew when to trust silence and when to break it. Suddenly, the chapel doors opened again, and in stumbled a man, panting, coat torn, dust streaked across his face. It was Doc Esteban Garcia, the traveling physician who serviced the outer settlements. He held a crumpled paper in one hand and panic in his eyes. "Don't open that coffin," he called out. Gasps rippled across the room. Martha stepped forward, voice tight. "Why not?" The doctor caught his breath, eyes darting to the wooden box. "I looked over the certificate. the one that pronounced Samuel Ellsworth dead. It was signed by a doctor I've never heard of, and I've been in this territory 15 years. The name isn't registered with any medical office, here or in Tombstone. Boone's brow furrowed. You saying there was no legal confirmation? Garcia nodded grimly. No autopsy. No hospital, no nothing. The crowd stirred. Some pressed toward the walls, others whispered frantic prayers. Widow Baxter's face went pale as parchment. Then a voice cracked from the back, raw, defensive, breaking under pressure. This is madness! Henry McGraw stepped forward, his voice shaking. You're listening to a child. To superstition. He's dead. The man's gone. But no one believed him. Not anymore. Boone stared hard. Then you won't mind if we open it. Henry's hand twitched at his side. His jaw clenched. Martha stepped toward him, her voice low but steel strong. Why are you afraid, Henry? He stammered. I'm not. The knocking came again. Louder, angrier, real. Henry paled. Lucille pointed, her tiny hand unwavering. He says he's scared. He says he can't breathe. Then from across the room, Widow Baxter spoke, her voice a tremble. Open the box. Whatever's in there, let it out. Living or dead, it don't belong sealed shut no more. Martha placed her hand on the coffin's lid. Marshal Boone drew closer, ready, and then Henry broke. Henry McGraw stepped backward, his face drained of color, sweat beading on his brow. His hands, once confident and still, now trembled like reeds in the wind. Marshal Boone narrowed his gaze. You've got something to say, Henry? The whole room was watching. Henry's lips parted, but no words came. Then, as Martha's hand gripped the coffin lid, he lunged forward. No, you can't open it, he shouted. It's disrespectful to the dead. Boone was faster. He caught Henry by the arm, twisting it back with practiced ease. I don't reckon you care about respect, Boone said. Not when you're trying to stop a mother from knowing the truth. Henry struggled, but Martha stepped away, her voice like iron. You drugged him, didn't you? The room fell deathly silent. Henry froze in Boone's grip. Then something broke inside him. His shoulders sagged, his knees buckled, and he whispered, I didn't mean to kill him. Gasps swept through the chapel like a sandstorm. It hadn't always been this way between Henry and Samuel. They'd grown up under the same roof for a time, rode the same horses, fought the same schoolyard fights. But Samuel had built his life straight, with sweat and soil. Henry, he'd always wanted more. When Samuel married Martha and inherited the larger share of his family's land, something in Henry soured. He never said it outright, but that bitterness never left his bones. Henry's voice cracked. I just wanted him to sign. That land. It's worth a fortune with the railroad coming, but he wouldn't sell. He said he'd rather die with it than give it up. He sank to his knees. So I slipped something in his drink, just to make him sleep. That's all I wanted. Martha's voice cracked. But he didn't wake up. Henry nodded, weeping now. I panicked, bribed the undertaker, paid a man to sign the certificate. I thought maybe he really was dead. You thought? Boone asked, his voice a blade. I didn't check, Henry sobbed. I didn't want to know. I just wanted it all to be over. Martha's fists trembled. You put him in that box, alive. Henry couldn't meet her eyes. And then 3 pounding knocks from inside the coffin, louder than before. Desperate. Lucille shrieked. Martha gasped and fell to her knees beside the box. Samuel, she cried, placing both hands flat on the lid. Hold on, I'm here. Marshal Boone stood tall, his voice clear. Reverend Doctor, get ready, we're opening it. Henry let out a strangled cry. No, don't. But no one listened anymore. Boone turned to Martha. She nodded. The chapel was silent, save for the flicker of lantern light and the sharp breathing of those still brave enough to stay. Martha Ellsworth knelt beside the coffin, her hands pressed to the lid. Every heartbeat felt like thunder in her chest. Marshal Boone stood beside her, sleeves rolled, hands firm. James Harlan, an old rancher and friend of Samuel's, stepped forward too, silent but resolute. Lucille clung to her mother's dress, whispering over and over, "He's waitin'. He's scared. Mama, hurry." Then Reverend Elias Thorne stepped closer, Bible in one hand, the other raised toward the heavens. "Lord, if a soul still lingers in this vessel, give us strength to set it free." Boone and James exchanged a glance. Together they began to lift. The lid groaned as it gave way. Martha held her breath. The lantern light spilled over the man within, Samuel Ellsworth. He was there, alive, pale as linen, lips cracked and dry but breathing, weak, shallow, but steady. His eyes fluttered open, confused, blinking against the light. He gasped. The sound was broken, like a man surfacing after nearly drowning. "Martha," her hands flew to his face. "Samuel, oh dear God, you're alive." Tears ran down her cheeks as she kissed his forehead, his hands, his mouth. As Boone and James eased Samuel up from the coffin, Lucille threw her arms around him, sobbing, "Papa, I heard you. I heard you." Samuel could barely speak, but his eyes, those clear, beloved eyes, filled with tears. He had heard them. Through the dark, through the fear, he had held on. Martha reached into her pocket and drew out the silver pocket watch, placing it in his hand. His fingers closed slowly around it. Reverend Thorne stepped back, crossing himself. "It's a miracle," he whispered. But Marshal Boone didn't look away from Henry McGraw, still kneeling at the altar steps, face twisted in horror. Henry mumbled, "It ain't possible." He was dead. Boone walked over slowly, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You buried a man alive, McGraw, lied to a family, tried to steal a life for the price of land." Henry trembled. "I didn't know. I thought he—" "You didn't care," Boone finished. Outside, hooves thundered across the street. Then bootsteps. Doors swung open wide. Sheriff Elijah Granger entered. He was broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed, and carried the weight of too many years of truth delayed. Granger was the kind of lawman who read people before they spoke. He polished his badge not for pride, but because it reminded him who he was supposed to be. He'd seen enough broken men and buried secrets to know evil rarely shouted. It whispered. He took one look at Samuel, alive, and his face hardened. "I served in the war," he muttered to Boone. "And I've seen men buried who shouldn't have been. Never thought I'd see it again here." He turned to Henry with steel in his voice. "Take him." Two deputies moved fast. Henry didn't fight. He just wept. As the church cleared, and the sun dipped low over Dry Hollow, Martha sat beside her husband's coffin, now just a resting bench. Her hands never left his. She had saved him, and justice had found its boots. 2 weeks later, the people of Dry Hollow gathered in the county courthouse, its floorboards worn by boots and its walls thick with heat and history. The benches were packed, hats in laps, silence heavy. Some had come for justice, others to witness what it looked like when it finally arrived. Henry McGraw sat shackled, thinner than before. The weight of shame wore heavier than iron. His eyes were sunken, his voice gone quiet. Across the aisle, Martha Ellsworth sat with Lucille in her lap. Beside them, Samuel leaned on a cane, wrapped in a coat a size too big, his strength still returning, his spirit steady as stone. At the front, the territorial judge presided, gavel resting like judgment incarnate. The prosecutor stood. "The defendant is charged with attempted murder, forgery of a death record, bribery of a public official, and illegal burial of a living man. The crowd murmured low. Then the judge spoke. "Does the victim wish to speak?" Samuel rose slowly. His cane clicked softly as he stepped forward, every movement measured. The man who stood before the court wasn't just a survivor. He was a testament to endurance, to love, to the voice of a child who refused to stop believing. Samuel placed something on the table in front of him, his silver pocket watch. It ticked now, steady, alive. He looked directly at Henry. "I was buried by a man I once called family," he said. "I lay beneath the earth, breathing dirt, and hearing my little girl crying for me." The room was still. Henry didn't do this out of hate. He did it because he wanted something more than he valued my life. He wanted land, and he buried his soul with mine, thinking it'd be worth it. He paused. "I don't ask for revenge, but I do ask for truth, and truth don't stay quiet forever." The judge nodded, face like carved granite. He raised the gavel. "Henry McGraw, you are sentenced to 25 years of hard labor at Yuma Territorial Prison. May justice find your hands and repentance your heart." Henry's head dropped. The courtroom exhaled. The spell of fear was broken. Marshal Boone stepped out quietly into the light, saying nothing, just watching the wind stir dust across the steps. Sheriff Granger remained behind, his hand resting on the worn star pinned to his chest. Boone would leave town that night, headed south for a water dispute. He never stayed where justice was done. Granger, on the other hand, sat long after the courtroom emptied, polishing that badge until the gold caught the sunset like fire. 1 month later, dawn broke gently over the hills of Dry Hollow. The desert still slept under a quilt of dust and silence, but at the edge of town, where the land met the morning light, something had changed. The Ellsworth homestead, once shadowed by grief, now basked in the golden hush of a second chance. Samuel Ellsworth sat on the porch, blanket over his knees, a mug of strong black coffee in hand. His frame was still thin, but his eyes no longer carried the darkness of the grave. They watched the world like a man who had been given a few extra pages in a book he thought was closed. Beside him sat Martha, her head on his shoulder, her face calm, her heart finally unburdened. And running barefoot in the field, sunlight tangled in her hair, was Lucille, her laughter skipping across the fence rails like a hymn. She twirled and danced, chasing shadows that once loomed large, but now had no place in the light. Martha turned to her husband. "She smiles more now," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "So do you." He opened his palm, and there it was, his silver pocket watch. It ticked steadily, its sound soft, rhythmic, alive. Lucille ran up the porch steps and climbed into his lap, her fingers curling around the watch. "Why does it tick now, Papa?" Samuel smiled. "Because your mama never stopped believing. Because you kept calling for me." Martha leaned in. "Because time wasn't done with us yet." They sat together as the sun lifted fully over the prairie, washing everything in the warm promise of day. Out here, where the land is harsh and justice slow, it's easy to believe the story ends when a man is buried. But sometimes, love digs deeper than a grave, and a child's voice, pure and unshaken, can carry further than any lawman's gun. In the end, it wasn't just a mother's courage or a lawman's resolve that saved Samuel Ellsworth. It was Lucille's voice, soft but unshaken, that pierced through fear, silence, and